Okay, welcome back. We're going to be doing more readings from Robert Whiting's Japan. This one is actually the first of a three-part series called Spy Games. The Cold War in Japan. It was first published June 6, 2022. If you want to see the full article, you can read it on robertwhiting.substack.com. The links are in the description below. I'll start. Postwar Intrigue. Tokyo. The United States and Russia have a long history of espionage with each other in Japan dating back to the early years of the occupation. When the Cold War began, the G2 or GHQ intelligence wing chief General Charles Willoughby was alarmed by the rise of Mao Tse Tung in China and growing communist influence in North Korea, and established a number of counterintelligence operations designed to suppress rising left-wing activists in Japan, enlisting the services of intelligence officers of the defunct Japanese Imperial Army who monitored communist activity in Japan, as well as in Korea, Manchuria, and the Soviet Union. One of its operations was the Canon Agency, previously introduced on this site. It was named after the Major Jack Canon, a former Texas Border Patrol agent and explosives expert who had served in Borneo. Canon had arrived in Tokyo in September 1945. He blew open the safe at the German embassy, where he discovered documents that showed the notorious Sorge Soviet spy ring was still in operation. Richard Sorge was a legendary Soviet spy who worked undercover in Tokyo from the 1930s, posing as a Nazi journalist. His real job was to keep Moscow informed of Japan's military intentions. The dashing Sorge's exploits have been chronicled in many publications, starting with Shanghai Conspiracy by Willoughby in 1952. Sorge was a heavy drinker, a womanizer who slept with his colleagues' wives, and a reckless motorcycle rider who rode at high speeds through the states of the capital at all hours of the day or night. But he also supplied his superiors with intelligence that revealed that Germany would invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, which Stalin ignored, and that its ally Japan did not intend to participate. Intel, the Soviet leader this time, apparently believed. It was valuable information that allowed the Russians to move forces from Siberia to Moscow to repel the German invasion. Sorge was arrested in October 1942 by the Kempeitai. He confessed under torture and was hanged at Sugamo Prison on November 7, 1944, along with Asahi Shimbun journalist Hotsumi Ozaki, a communist sympathizer who had provided him with intel about the government of Japan's wartime intentions. Stalin had declined to intervene on his behalf in a prisoner exchange proposed by the Japanese government. After the war, Sorge's remains were recovered from the Sugamo prison graveyard and interred at the Tama Cemetery in Fuchu by his live-in lover, a neighborhood barmaid who tended his grave until she died in 2000 at the age of 89 and was then buried alongside him. He was posthumously awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union in 1964. Ian Fleming later called him the most formidable spy in history. Acclaimed director Masahiro Shinoda memorialized Sorge in a hit 2003 film, Spy Sorge. Members of the Sorge spy ring, radio operator Max Clausen and his wife Anna, had been in prison but were mistakenly released by occupying American soldiers. Canon got word they were living in Karizawa and gave chase, but Clausen and his wife managed to escape to Vladivostok, along with a German Soviet spy named Vukovich, who had been operating in the Yokohama area. The occupation of Japan was a military one, with Americans in charge and MacArthur running the show. The Soviet Union had invaded the northern Japan Isles at the very last stages of World War II, when the country was reeling from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But U.S. President Harry Truman had refused to allow the Soviets to participate in the occupation of Japan. The Russians were relegated to overseeing the South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. The Soviet consulate was located in a building right across the street and 2 doors down from the Foreign Correspondents' Press Club in Marunouchi, where there was a large American contingent. The Russians were so unpopular that U.S. journalists would have a few drinks and go outside with their cameras, aim them at the windows of an army general in charge of the Soviet consulate, and fire off their flashes. The Canon Agency, a team of 26 agents of all backgrounds, including Korean Americans from San Diego, moved into the Gatsby-like Iwasaki estate in Ueno Park in 1947. They managed to infiltrate a North Korean operation, bringing in heroin from Pyongyang, designed to raise money for the Japan Communist Party, leading to midnight shootouts in such places as Yokohama's Nogayama Park, where Canon was shot in the leg. Jack Canon was a handsome, strapping 6-footer who used his considerable charm on female employees of the Soviet mission to gain inside access. One of Canon's assets was a Japanese clerk at the Russian embassy who provided him with secret reports, including photos and descriptions of the latest communications equipment the Russians were using in Tokyo. Canon also turned a policeman who worked at the Soviet embassy, as well as a Japanese field operative working for the Russians, and supplied him with misinformation in the form of documents and tape recordings to dispense to his contacts. Soviet operatives, for their part, tried to ingratiate themselves with communist sympathizers working in the GHQ, entertaining them with lavish dinners, a rarity in a city that was, for a time, on the brink of starvation. Canadian diplomat E. Herbert Norman played a decisive role in the decision by SCAP, Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, in 1946 to ban all Japanese parties except the Japanese Communist Party, JCP. Alongside his diplomatic activities, GHQ New Dealers purposely left out any anti-espionage laws to assist their fellow communists. But in 1949, occupation authorities, in conjunction with the Japanese government, carried out a sweeping Red Purge, firing tens of thousands of pro-communists from government jobs and teaching positions. The purge was intensified with the outbreak of the Korean War. Violent protests followed. Willoughby's G2 used ethnic Korean yakuza like Hisayuki Machi, aka the Ginza Machi, boss of the Toseikai, one of the top Tokyo gangs, to suppress the leftist demonstrations in and around the city. In the post-occupation era, the CIA replaced the G2 intelligence groups, influencing Japanese government policy by financing pro-American Liberal Democratic Party politicians to the tune of $1 million a month, making sure that the ruling party firmly supported the USA, which had 150,000 soldiers stationed on bases all over the country. The LDP used Yakuza to help fend off violent protests from left-wing protesters, attempting to block passage of the extension of the Security Treaty in 1960. The CIA also began making twice-weekly U-2 surveillance flights over Russia from Atsugi Base, using civilian pilots. This went on until the Soviets downed a U-2 piloted by Gary Powers in 1960. Then flights were switched to Taiwan and flown by Taiwanese pilots. However, data analysis continued at a top-secret location on Fuchu Air Station just outside Tokyo. American CIA agents had an office in the U.S. Embassy in Toranomon, euphemistically called Document Research, while Soviet agents operated from the new Soviet embassy in the Roppongi area. Diplomatic relations between Japan and the USSR, which had been ruptured when Russia declared war on Japan in 1945, were restored in 1956. The area became known as a hotbed of Soviet spies. The Soviet embassy was just steps away from the popular Gaijin haunts the Club 88 and Nicholas, to both of which Soviet agents were frequent visitors. There were reports of Russian agents attempting to bribe American employees of the Stars and Stripes, for example, for information on the activities of the U.S. military inside American bases. One of them, an editor named Tom Scully, was wined and dined repeatedly by a Soviet agent who offered Scully thousands of dollars in cash and other perks to come over to the other side. Scully enjoyed the wining and dining, but turned down the money and reported the goings-on to the Japanese authorities, and the agent was deported. Another locus of activity that aroused interest was an international clinic directly across the street from Nicholas. It was run by the white Russian doctor Eugene Atkinsov, whose parents had fled to Harbin, China during the Bolshevik Revolution. From there, he'd come to Tokyo in 1942 as a medical student, paying his tuition by playing captured American pilots in Japanese war propaganda films, speaking American English with a fake Russian accent, and stayed on stateless, a man without a passport. The doctor set up his own practice, and since he was fluent in Russian, the leather chairs in his waiting room were filled with patients from the nearby Russian embassy reading Russian language periodicals. With the Cold War at its peak, that fact alone was enough to attract the attention of Japanese authorities, who suspected that a communist lurked behind every cherry tree. The Koancho, Japanese Public Security Intelligence Agency, had placed Atkinsov under constant surveillance. Undercover detectives followed him around Tokyo in taxis and unmarked cars. They dined at the same restaurants and they tapped his phones. So badly, in fact, that Atkinsov remarked to his friends that he could hear the cops talking to one another. There was never any evidence produced that Atkinsov was a spy, and logic dictated that Atkinsov, who had escaped the Russian Revolution, would not likely be a communist sympathizer. However, because of the aforementioned reports and the indisputable fact that Atkinsov's clinic was, in fact, only a city block from the Soviet embassy in Azabu, Japanese police, not exactly sophisticated internationalists, reasoned constant surveillance was warranted. The Japanese police eventually arrested Atkinsov on charges of spying, but later released him. If you look at the article, we have some sources and recommended reading. The first is interviews with former Canon agents Victor Matsui and the late Alonzo Shattuck. He passed away about a year ago in Arizona. And also former Stars and Stripes editor Tom Scully, and of course also the famous and late Dr. Eugene Atkinsov. For further reading, we have three sources. One is Owen Matthews, An Impeccable Spy. That's published by Bloomsbury, London, 2019. The second one, by Major General Charles Willoughby, was called Shanghai Conspiracy, published by E.P. Dutton, New York, 1952. And the third one is by Eiji Takemai, titled Inside GHQ, published by Continuum, London, 2002. Oh, sorry, we have more. We also have, there is an article on the site. I probably will read that later. It's on the Canon Agency. It's on Robert Whiting's Japan. It's called Canon Agency, the inside story of U.S. Black Ops in post-war Japan. We also have Mark Perkins, who wrote, Was E. Herbert Norman really a spy? The Art of Polemics, September 15th, 2014. Oh, Dick Samuels. Richard Samuels wrote Special Duty, A History of the Japanese Intelligence Community, Bloomsbury, New York, 2019. I've read several of Dick Samuel's books. I don't know if he's still an MIT professor. Tim Weiner wrote Legacy of Ashes, published by Doubleday, New York, 2007. And I think previously I've read one of Robert's articles, the 4-part series. It's the U-2 spy plane, White Knuckles from the Start. That was the first one in the 4-part series. We also have another article, Doctor to the Stars, in Japan, was once arrested as a suspected Russian spy. This is about Dr. Atkinsov. And finally, it concludes with thanks to Hiroki Allen, Peter Miller, Mitch Murata, Kevin Novak, and Joseph P. Schmelzeitz, Jr. The end. I'll come back with the second in the 3-part series. Again, if you like this, please head over to Robert Whiting's Substack. You're going to find all his articles. Most are behind a paywall, so it kind of pays to subscribe. If you have any requests, please put them in the comments below, and I will come back to you shortly.